Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. We've reached the penultimate episode in our series about great political fictions. And for these last two, I'm turning to fictionalizations and dramatizations of high American politics. Next time, it's going to be Hamilton. Today, I'm talking about Curtis Sittenfeld's unputdownable novel, American Wife, which is about the relationship between George W. Bush and his wife, Laura Bush. It was George Bush's presidency, but this is Laura Bush's story. When George Bush was coming to the end of his second term in office at the end of 2008, he was the most unpopular American president for at least half a century. His approval ratings were terrible. On some scores, on some polls, fewer than a quarter of American voters thought he was doing a good job. That's worse than his father, George H.W. Bush, at the end of his term of office. It's worse than Jimmy Carter. It's even, on some polls at least, worse than Richard Nixon when he was being hounded out after Watergate. You have to go back to Harry Truman in 1952 to find a president who polled as badly as that at the end of his time in office. In Truman's case, he was deeply unloved and unadmired, mainly because of a war, the Korean War, which in 1952 was thought by most Americans to have gone really badly, and it was Truman's fault. It was a war that was seen to have failed to have achieved its aims. It had cost America a huge amount of money and blood. Tens of thousands of Americans had died, and it seemed to symbolize the failure of Truman's crusade against communism, and he got the blame. And in 2008, something similar was going on with George W. Bush. It was a failed war that was primarily, not exclusively, but primarily responsible for his terrible ratings. The Iraq War was seen by most Americans at that point as having been a failure. It symbolized the failure of Bush's war on terror. It had cost America a huge amount of money and blood, thousands, not tens of thousands of lives, but hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives. And Bush, and some other people too, but Bush, got the blame. But it wasn't just the Iraq War that meant he was tanking in the polls in 2008. The second term of his presidency was, on many measures, something of a disaster. He was still haunted by the shade of Hurricane Katrina and his administration's response to that natural disaster, which had made a mockery of his mantra to be what he called a compassionate conservative, because when the hurricane hit New Orleans and its poorest citizens, of whom there were many, and many of them were black, were seen to be suffering terrible conditions, terrible disease, near starvation, abandoned. It looked like they were being abandoned by their government too. The response of Bush's administration was both callous and incompetent, and it exposed them. It exposed them to many Americans as essentially fraudulent. This was not compassionate conservatism. This was callous conservatism. And by the end of 2008, something else was going on too. The global economy was in meltdown. It happened on George W. Bush's watch. Some people blamed him. Some people credited him in the eye of the storm for holding his nerve and indeed for reneging on many of his ideological principles and bailing out the US economy. But after Lehman Brothers went under in the final months of 2008, George W. Bush did often have his characteristic look, which was rabbit in the headlights. He looked out of his depth. He often looked afraid, and he had every reason to be afraid. It was a terrifying moment. All world leaders were afraid at the end of 2008. But it also looked like he needed to be bailed out by the grown-ups himself, and that meant the central bankers. It was a mess. His second term had been a mess. His presidency looked like it was ending in the most almighty mess. People couldn't wait for Obama to take over. And yet the other thing that was characteristic about George W. Bush is he was pretty relaxed about all of that. Along with his rabbit in the headlights look, he also tended often to look surprisingly sanguine about his unpopularity. It sort of rubbed off him, And even after he left office, he gave a number of interviews, he appeared at a few events, he was profiled in newspapers by journalists who were surprised by how cheerful he was. He said he was looking forward to retirement. There are lots of things that he thought he wanted to do. He'd probably had enough of politics. He was quite relaxed about his record in office, and he thought history, and maybe God, would be his judge. He was quite self-effacing and self-deprecating. He was a funny guy, and he was capable of making people laugh. Some of his advisors told him, and I think he did take comfort from this, to look at the example of Truman himself, so the one president who was even more unpopular at the end than George W. Bush, Harry S. Truman, over the following decades, more than half a century, gradually, steadily, but dramatically improved his reputation to the extent that by the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, Truman was often regarded by historians as one of the best 20th century American presidents. In those polls that are occasionally done, in which American historians are asked to rank all the presidents, Truman's is one of the most spectacular rise up those charts. He now often appears in the top 10. He's ranked below, but near Reagan and Roosevelt, both the Roosevelts. He is one of the titans of 20th century politics. That hasn't happened to George W. Bush. In those rankings, Bush is still somewhere, not right at the bottom. Donald Trump is at the moment usually right at the bottom, but certainly in the bottom half. He does not have a good historical reputation. But the most striking thing about Bush's post-presidency is that his popularity with the public has really gone up. His current approval ratings are somewhere near 60%, so from 25% to 60%. It's an extraordinary turnaround. It's not completely clear what explains it, but he has come to symbolize for many Americans a post-partisan politics, that is, pre the partisanship of now, but in his period since he left office, he has been quite an ecumenical politician. He's made friends. He and his wife, Laura, have made friends with the Obamas. They seem to get on pretty well with the Obamas. He doesn't seem to have any time for Donald Trump. He memorably said at Donald Trump's inaugural in 2017, that was some weird shit. He is still funny and self-effacing. He has reinvented himself as an artist, a painter. He paints pictures of Iraq War veterans. Not many people think the pictures are that good, but a lot of people are touched by them and touched by him. He's not tried to intervene in politics. He's not tried to big up or even defend his record. He's been pretty silent on the issues of the day, and by being quiet, he has slowly and steadily seen the American public start to feel some genuine affection for him, not probably for his presidency, but for him. And the other thing that he has going for him that he knew when he left office, and he said it explicitly in those profiles, those interviews in 2009, when people said to him, how do you think people are going to remember you in your time in office? He would say, well, I've got one thing going for me, and it's always been the thing I've had going for me. I've got Laura. I've got my wife, Laura Bush, because they don't like me, but they sure as hell love her. And they did, and they do, and they did throughout his presidency. She was much more popular than he was. She was, for many Americans, the better half of that couple in the White House. It is true that first ladies are often more popular than the president. And it is one of the remarkable features of American politics that it is always first ladies. So there have been no female presidents, but there have also not been since, I think, Buchanan before the American Civil War, any unmarried presidents. I think Grover Cleveland was unmarried, but then he got married in the White House. In the 20th century and the 21st, they've all been men and they've all had wives. Not always their first wives, but they've all had first ladies. And since modern polling has begun, those first ladies have tended to be more popular than their husbands. Michelle Obama was more popular than Barack Obama. Barbara Bush was a lot more popular than George H.W. Bush. Rosalind Carter was more popular than Jimmy Carter. Betty Ford was more popular than Gerald Ford. Pat Nixon was more popular than Richard Nixon. There are some exceptions. Melania Trump seems to be as unpopular as her husband. That is, people who don't like Trump really don't like her. And actually, some people who really do like Trump still don't like her. Nancy Reagan was slightly less popular than Ronald Reagan, but that's probably more a reflection of the fact that at the end of his time in office, he was seriously popular. And Hillary Clinton was consistently less popular than Bill Clinton, including at the end, Even after Monica Lewinsky, Clinton left office more popular than his wife. But Laura Bush is the exception the other way. She was spectacularly more popular than George W. Bush. So when he had approval ratings of around 25%, she had approval ratings of somewhere between 70 and 80%. That is the biggest gap of all. And though he has got more popular, she doesn't seem to have got any less popular. How to explain it? The thing about Laura Bush is that she was exceptionally unexceptional. She struck most Americans as a bit like them. She was pretty ordinary. She had a relatively ordinary background. She'd been school teacher, librarian. As First Lady, she was modest. She was loyal to her husband, but not completely loyal, and I'll come on to that in a second. She was authentic. Among other things, she was authentically Texan. He wasn't. He was born in Connecticut. He moved with his family, with his father, George H.W. Bush, to Texas when his father was an oil man. And actually, he went to school in Midland, Texas, which is the same town that Laura Bush went to school. But then he was shipped back to the Northeast to a fancy prep school, and then he went to Yale. And he had to reinvent himself as a Texan for political purposes. She never had to reinvent herself as anything. Even now, you just need to listen to her. She sounds much more Texan than he does. She was modest, she was supportive, but she also, on one or two questions, made it clear that she did not agree with her husband. And for that reason, she was able to soften his political image and, for some Democrats, to represent the better part of the Bush partnership. The two questions on which she made it clear she did not agree with her husband, and she said this modestly, quietly. She did not make a song and dance about it, but she allowed it to be known in interviews. Not very often, but enough. One, she didn't agree with him on abortion. She was pro-choice. He and his party, by that point, we're talking the first decade of this century, had become rabidly pro-life. The talk was about how to repeal Roe versus Wade. Laura Bush did not agree with her husband or his party on that question. The Republican Party and Bush himself at this point were also adamantly opposed to same-sex marriage. Laura Bush did not agree with her husband or his party on that question either. Bush justified it as a Christian. Laura Bush let it be known she didn't buy it. And yet she also managed to remain a very, very loyal, not just wife, but First Lady. She was enormously supportive of him. It was clear that he relied on her very heavily. It appeared from the outside, and everything that's happened since seems to confirm it, to be a very happy marriage, a marriage that could accommodate these political differences. He didn't get any of the credit for that, but she did. She was and remains much loved. And yet her popularity in a way was so convenient, it can almost look like a contrivance, like it was engineered. It wasn't. Part of the point of her appeal was nothing about her seemed like it had been contrived. She genuinely did seem to be the person that she was. And yet the political convenience of her relationship with the president made some people, including some people within the Republican Party, a little suspicious of her. It's hard to imagine what it must have been like to be Laura Bush, to be that person who was authentically ordinary and modest and seemingly quite uncomfortable in the limelight, though she accepted her role as First Lady. She didn't shy away from it. She didn't do what Melania Trump seems to do at various points, which is to disappear. She was always there by her husband's side. And as he got more unpopular, she did not in any way abandon him. And yet, that discomfort and that sense that there was something contrived going on here, that she had become a cipher for forces within the Republican Party, within the wider American public and political firmament, makes it hard to imagine what it would have been like until you read Curtis Sittenfeld's American Wife, which is the story of what it would have been like. It is one of the truly great novels about the accidents of politics. Laura Bush is thrust into the limelight accidentally, partly because her husband, in many ways, was a kind of accidental president, not just in the way he got elected, but in the personality he brought to the office. He both was and wasn't a skillful politician. This novel is a brilliant account of what it would be like to find yourself not in his position, but in hers. And it is her story because it starts, indeed, the central section of the book, which is the first part of the book, the section which shapes everything that is to come, describes her life well before she ever met George W. Bush. So the characters in this book are called Alice Lindgren and Charlie Blackwell. Alice Lindgren is Laura Bush. Charlie Blackwell is George Bush. And there's no attempt to conceal this. This isn't a loosely fictionalized account. This is an account that tracks very closely the life stories of both of these people. It is them. There's no point in beating around the bush. It's them. But it is also fictionalized, so some of the details are changed. This is a novel. The Bush story is located in Texas. This story is located in Wisconsin. The real George W. Bush, earlier in his life, became a managing partner in a baseball team, the Texas Rangers. In this novel, Charlie Blackwell becomes the managing partner of the Milwaukee Brewers. In the novel, the couple have one daughter, not two. In the novel, the father of Charlie Blackwell isn't president of the United States. He is a failed presidential candidate. He tried, he ran in 1968 and didn't get it. He still comes from a political dynasty, the man that Alice/Laura marries, but she is not marrying into a family where her father-in-law becomes president of the United States. Those details are different, but the story is the same. It has the same arc. It has almost entirely the same arc. And by the time we reach the presidency, it is the presidency of George W. Bush. And the timings are the same. The events happen at the same time they happened in real life to the real couple. In the first part of the story, two things happen to Alice Lindgren that have nothing to do with George W. Bush/Charlie Blackwell, but they are the two central events of her life, in a way. They overshadow everything that comes after. This is a novel. One of these things really happened to Laura Bush, and one of them didn't. I mean, I could say of the one that didn't, that it didn't as far as we know, but Curtis Sittenfeld went out of her way when this book was published in 2010 to say she was not saying that this happened to Laura Bush. This is imagined. The two things are that Alice Lindgren/Laura Bush, when she was 17, killed someone and then had an abortion. The first of those two things is true. The second is the one that Curtis Sittenfeld simply imagines. And in the novel, the two things are intimately related. The killing is the result of a car accident. It's an accident, but it is an accident for which, I'm going to call her Alice now because we're in the fictional novel, but Alice means Laura, for which Alice was to blame. When she was 17, driving herself on her own to a party, she went through a stop sign. She didn't see the stop sign. It was obscurely placed by the side of the road. But nonetheless, it was not her right of way. And she crashed into a car that was coming the other way and who had right of way. She suffered minor injuries in the accident. The driver of the car, a 17-year-old boy on his way to the same party, broke his neck and was killed. It was an accident. It was a terrible accident. It was also a terrible, almost unimaginable coincidence because the car that was being driven by this boy was being driven by a friend of hers. Subsequent speculation about Laura Bush suggested that actually he was her boyfriend. She always denied that. In the novel, the car is being driven by a boy called Andrew Imhoff. He is not Alice's boyfriend, but in the novel, it is made clear to us that he is on the cusp of becoming Alice's boyfriend and lover. Indeed, the two are in love. And in the novel, they've been in love since they were small children. They just didn't know it or articulate it. But just before the accident, they have been able to articulate it to each other. They are just beginning to feel their way into a relationship. And Alice, who's only 17 and knows nothing about life and not much about boys, has nonetheless started to speculate about whether this young man is going to turn out to be the love of her life. Of course, she doesn't know, but she feels something strong, and he does too. And it's clear he started to indicate to her that whatever torch she's been carrying for him all these years, they're only 17, he's been carrying for her. And they're on their way to this party. And the assumption is in the book that at this party, they are going to use a completely anachronistic phrase, hook up. And they're going to be a couple, but they never become a couple because she kills him purely by accident. But it is her fault, and she is very aware that it is her fault. And she is completely, understandably, consumed with guilt and remorse and terror. It's her fault, but at the same time, no one really blames her. She's 17 years old. The stop sign was not well placed. It's an accident. Her parents tell her to move on with her life. There is no question of discussing it, of therapy, of getting it out in the open. The belief, this is 1963, is that the best thing to do when something terrible like this happens is just to get on with life. Move on, leave it behind you. The parents of the boy who is killed do not want to press charges. She's aware in the town that they live that there is muttering about her. She overhears at one point a boy in their school say to someone else, that's why girls shouldn't be allowed driving licenses. But that's about as bad as it gets. But she is consumed with guilt, with a kind of survivor's guilt. And after a few weeks, she decides she must write a letter to Andrew's parents. She doesn't see Andrew's parents. She has no contact with them. Everyone decides the best thing for Alice is to kind of pretend that this never happened, which is, we would now say, probably a mistake from a therapeutic point of view. And she can't bear it. So she writes a letter to Andrew's parents, and she tries to work out when they won't be at home on their farm. And in the letter, she puts a heart-shaped locket. And in the letter, she says to Andrew's parents how sorry she is, how remorseful she is, and how she wishes it had been she who died and not Andrew. She takes it to the house. They're not in, but Andrew's brother, Pete, his older brother, Pete, a few years older, he's just back from college, is at home. And he's a mess because his younger brother has just been killed in a car crash, and the girl who was responsible has just shown up at their house. It's clear he's been drinking. He kind of was a mess anyway. Andrew was the good brother. But Pete is there and he invites Alice in and they have sex. It's not a seduction. It's not an assault, but it's in that vast grey area that lies between seduction and assault. He invites her up to his bedroom. She notices, incidentally, lying on his bed, an open copy of Atlas Shrugged. And she says to him, I've read that. And he says, yeah, it's good, but it's too long. And then they have sex. The sex is described, but it is no fun. And she goes back a few times and has sex with him again. And it gets more degrading. It gets less fun. This is some kind of expiation, but it's nasty. And then it ends. And then she discovers that she's pregnant. This is now the realms of fiction. All of this post the accident, and indeed pre the accident, is in the realm of fiction. The fact is the accident itself. Laura Bush did also find herself involved in exactly such a car crash in which a young man died. In the novel, when Alice discovers that she's pregnant, she realizes that she should have an abortion. Abortion is illegal at this point. She can't tell her parents, but luckily her grandmother, who is a Democrat, we are told, her father is a Republican, knows a woman in Chicago who is a doctor, who actually we discover in the course of the novel is Alice's grandmother's lover, because Alice, it turns out, has a grandmother who was briefly married, but has had a lifelong gay relationship with this woman in Chicago. And the doctor in Chicago agrees to perform the abortion. And so it's her grandmother who takes her to Chicago, and the abortion takes place. And her parents are never told. And Pete Imhoff, the brother, the father of the child, is never told. And then she gets on with her life. Unlike the car crash, she is not consumed with guilt about the abortion. It's not clear that she feels guilt at all. The car crash was an accident, but an accident about which she can never get past her sense that it was her responsibility. She internalizes that and she carries it with her for the rest of her life, not least because she is always speculating what might have happened between her and Andrew. Her abortion is not an accident, it's a necessity. It's a necessity as the result of an accident. The other thing that is really striking about the abortion as described in this book in 1963 is that it's illegal, but it's not political. Abortion wasn't much of a political issue in America in 1963. It had yet to be politicized. That was going to happen in the 1970s and the 1980s, leading to the kind of presidency that George W. Bush came to embody. In 1963, the fact that Alice's father is a Republican doesn't mean that he would be horrified by the fact his daughter was having an abortion. He would probably be horrified because it was illegal. But for many Republicans, abortion was a privacy issue. And the key fact about Alice's abortion is that it is a private choice and a private act. Her grandmother enables that to be possible. No one need know. Her grandmother is a Democrat. Her father is a Republican. There is no sense in her thinking about this and who should know and who shouldn't know that political considerations play a part. In the 1960s, Democrats were more likely to be opposed to abortion than Republicans because many Democrats were Catholics. There is no politics to Alice's abortion. All of the politics comes later. The rest of the novel comes in 3 parts, and each of these 3 parts is a stage, a moment, a long moment, in Alice's life with Charlie Blackwell / George W. Bush. Part 2 is them meeting and courting and getting married. Part 3 is the crisis in their marriage that happened when they were both in their early 40s. And part 4 is set in the final 18 months of George W. Bush / Charlie Blackwell's presidency, when he has become deeply unpopular, particularly over the Iraq War, but is also trying to sustain his presidency and to sustain the interests of the people who got him elected, including by trying to, in the novel, get someone onto the Supreme Court who conceivably could help with the repeal of Roe versus Wade. Didn't happen, but the politics is real. And the arc of that story matches the arc of George W. and Laura Bush's lives together. The courtship is described humorously and also itself as something slightly baffling, including to the 2 protagonists. It seems very unlikely to Alice that she's going to wind up with a man like Charlie Blackwell. So at this point, she's 30, she's single, she's had a relationship, one serious relationship, which is with a Vietnam vet, a man who'd lost his hand in Vietnam, who had been seriously injured, and who turns out to be an extremely cold and unpleasant man. And that relationship breaks down. She's single, but she doesn't think she wants to date a man like Charlie Blackwell, who is a frat boy, he's a drinker, he's a joker, he's a prankster, he's crude. He's been dating a lot of women. He's a womanizer. And the kind of women he's been dating are nothing like the demure, modest librarian, Alice Lindgren. It's not love at first sight, certainly on not her side. He sees something in her, but he also reveals himself very early on to be vulnerable. On their first date, Charlie tells Alice, that he's frightened of the dark. He can't bear to be alone in the dark. And on the one hand, it feels like a subterfuge to get her into bed. Don't leave me alone here. Come into the house. Come into my bedroom. I don't want to be alone in the dark. And on the other hand, it's completely genuine. She discovers he is and has a lifelong fear of the dark. And indeed, by the time we get to his presidency, and Alice is ruminating on a question that has puzzled a lot of Americans, which is, why did this man want to be president? She's thinking, why did my husband want to be president? Why did that man I married want to be president? He really, really didn't look like presidential material. And she thinks the key to the answer is something only known by her, or maybe by 1 or 2 members of his family. The reason that Charlie Blackwell wanted to be president is that he was afraid of the dark. And he knew that if he was president, even if Laura wasn't around, there would always be someone on the other side of the door at night. The president is always very, very near someone. There's someone nearby at night because they might need to wake him up at 4 a.m. to tell him that the Russians have landed. That's not what he's concerned about. He wants to know that if he's scared, there's someone on the other side of the door. Being president makes him feel secure. That's the man that Alice/Laura Bush marries. But at the same time, when she meets him, the other puzzle about him is that this prankster, drinking, womanizing, ne'er-do-well frat boy is running for public office. So age 30, when she meets him, he's running a quixotic, futile campaign for a congressional district in Wisconsin in the novel. It's not clear why he's doing it. On one of their first dates, he takes her to a campaign event and he's okay. He's got a stump speech, which he gives to an audience of elderly Wisconsins, if that's the word. He's okay, but he's not great. He doesn't really seem to know what he's doing. As far as she can gather, he partly feels a family obligation from what is becoming a political dynasty to get involved. He's competitive with his brothers, and he knows his brothers have political interest too. So he wants to show them he's up to it. He suspects that they think he's the black sheep of the family, and he's really adamant that he's not. He feels that he needs a legacy, and he's always talking about his legacy. It drives Alice mad that he says to her all the time, what's my legacy going to be? And she looks at him and thinks, why does a man like you think he needs a legacy? My God, if you thought you needed a legacy, maybe you should stop being such a dick. She still loves him. But also it's clear he's not just running for office, he's being run for office, because very early on one of these very early dates, she meets this baby-faced guy who in the novel is called Hank Ucker, who is the person behind Charlie Blackwell's run for office. Hank Ucker is Karl Rove. He is described in the book as Karl Rove. Karl Rove, who was the political operative pollster who worked for the Bush family and who spotted very early on when no one else saw it, that the really golden material in that family was George W. Bush. Unpromising as he seemed, Karl Rove spotted that this man could potentially be molded into a really successful national candidate. And this is the beginnings of that. He's just trying him out, feeling him out, giving him a taste for it. Doesn't expect him to win, but he thinks possibly somewhere down the line, this very unpromising candidate is a potential president. Nobody, literally nobody else sees it. Alice doesn't see it. Charlie Blackwell's parents definitely don't see it. His siblings don't see it. Only Hank/Karl Rove sees it. The third part of the book is set 10 years later. They're married. They got married quickly. In that previous section, the courtship lasts roughly 6 weeks. They get engaged. 6 weeks later, they're married. They've been married for 10 years by this point. They have a daughter. They tried but couldn't have another child in the novel. And Charlie is going through a kind of midlife crisis. He's talking all the time about his legacy, but it's going nowhere. His political career has amounted to nothing. Nothing's happened. He's been involved in running the family business. In the novel, the family business is a meat packing business. It's not oil. It's meat. Same difference. He's drinking too much, and Alice is increasingly bothered by his drinking, and his drinking is making his behavior worse. He's irascible. The humor is getting cruder and more unpleasant. She still loves him. She still sees the old Charlie in him, but it's a classic midlife crisis. She's seriously worried about how this marriage is going to last. He gets a great stroke of fortune, which is that a businessman friend of his invites him to join a cartel that's taking over the local Major League Baseball team, the Milwaukee Brewers, and they want to make him managing partner because they think he's a good front man. He doesn't have much money, but they think he's a good front man. And this is his dream job. He loves baseball. You can see he's thinking there'll be a lot of drinking involved and a lot of glad handing and a lot of pranking and practical jokes. He's in heaven. It's not quite a legacy, but it both perks him up and also makes his behavior get even worse because he's drinking more. And he's angry and angrier with Alice because Alice doesn't think that this is a great job, although she can see why Charlie wants to do it. And it all comes to a head at a reunion at Princeton. So the real Bush went to Yale. Charlie Blackwell goes to Princeton. Same difference. And at their 20-year reunion, there's a lot of drinking. He's very nervous beforehand, before he gets the job offer of the baseball job, because he thinks that his contemporaries are all going to be doing better than him and are going to be looking down on him. And then he's thrilled that he can boast to them that he's got the dream job, every frat boy's dream job. He's running a baseball team. He's going to be hanging out with the players. And indeed, it works. A lot of his Princeton classmates go, God, you always land on your feet. You're running a baseball team. So he's happy, but it's all a bit brittle. It's all a bit shallow. There's drink, and then this is the one point where this novel intersects with the one I was talking about last time, The Line of Beauty. And then there's also cocaine. He takes cocaine at the reunion. Alice discovers this. She's kind of horrified. It's of a piece. She's not a particularly puritanical or sanctimonious person at all, but enough is enough. And she leaves him and takes their daughter back to stay with her mother. Her grandmother has just died. So she goes back with her mother. Charlie is appalled. He didn't see it coming, and predictably, he falls apart. He starts drinking even more. He becomes abusive on the phone. The midlife crisis gets worse. But the central fact about Charlie Blackwell is that he's afraid of the dark. She leaves him alone in their house. They now have quite a big, spacious house. She takes their daughter. There's no one else there. She knows he will not be able to cope with that. She doesn't intend to come back, but she does worry what's going to happen to Charlie because he cannot be alone in the house. The one fact about him is he cannot spend a night alone in the dark, and indeed he can't. So when she goes to her mother, he goes back to his parents, and he stays with them. He persuades their maid, their black maid, to look after him because he can't even bear to be alone in their house. He needs someone nearby. He needs someone on the other side of the door. She does it because she's fond of him, but she realizes this is madness. She thinks what he needs is a pastor. What he needs is Jesus in his life. She can't ask her pastor to come and speak to him because she goes to a black church, and she knows Charlie Blackwell is not in any obvious sense racist, but he has inherited all of the prejudices of his time and of his class. And she knows he's not going to listen to a black pastor. He will be, if nothing else, embarrassed and uncomfortable, pouring his heart out to someone who is not white. So she goes to the Yellow Pages and she finds a white pastor. And this man comes round and it works. Charlie Blackwell, as indeed to a certain extent happened to George W. Bush, when the drinking got too much and his marriage looked like it might be on the rocks, finds Jesus, or rediscovers Jesus, or indeed is born again. And Jesus and this pastor get him off the booze. He finds Jesus and he stops drinking, or he stops drinking and he finds Jesus. It's one way round or the other. The two things happen more or less simultaneously in the novel. And Alice comes back, and she comes back to find a man who is still recognizably her husband. He hasn't really changed. He's still a frat boy. He still makes crude jokes. He still loves breaking wind and thinking that that's the funniest thing in the world. He's funny. He's optimistic. Giving up the drink is tough. And as he describes to her, there are nights where she wakes up and he's not in the bed. And it's not because he's frightened of the dark. It's because he's frightened that he's going to drink whiskey. The craving is too much. And he calls the pastor, and the pastor comes round, and she finds them praying together downstairs. But he gets through and he stops drinking, and their marriage is saved. He credits Jesus, but he also credits her. If she hadn't left him, he would never have got off the booze. He was about to become, and he does indeed go on to become, the managing partner of a baseball team. But if he'd been doing that while he was drinking, it would have ended in disaster for sure. And that would have happened if she hadn't left him. And if she hadn't left him, he wouldn't have found Jesus. And if he hadn't found Jesus, he wouldn't have given up drinking. She gets the credit from him. She doesn't think she deserves the credit because she left him not for any pragmatic or strategic or tactical reason. She left him because she didn't want to be married to him anymore. And she's amazed, frankly, to discover that her husband is born again and sober. And she's delighted, and she gets her husband back. He gives her the credit. As we discover in the final part of the book, which is set towards the end of his presidency, many Americans give her the blame. She is aware, once George W. Bush is president, that is, Charlie Blackwell is president, and has embarked on this war, which turns out, in the eyes of most Americans, to be a disaster, that if only she hadn't left him and got him off the booze, none of that would have happened. They say to her, not to her face, but she's aware it's being said all the time online, why the hell couldn't she have let him carry on drinking? Because if he'd carried on drinking, he wouldn't be anywhere near the White House. Interestingly, the Barbara Bush character in the book says the same thing to her when she leaves him. When she leaves, Barbara Bush, that is, old Mrs. Blackwell, calls her up at her mother's house and says, come on, Alice, you've made your point, come home. Enough's enough. You've had your little stand, but he needs you. You know he can't be alone. He's the man you married. Who did you think you were marrying? You're marrying Charlie Blackwell. He's exactly the person you thought you were marrying. You don't like him drinking? It's your job to put up with it. You knew who he was when you married him. It's not your job to get him clean. It's your job to put up with it. Alice doesn't accept it. He gets clean. He becomes president. When we see them again in the final part of the book, it's 18 months out from the end of his presidency. The Iraq War is a disaster. His popularity has tanked. We don't hear about Hurricane Katrina. We don't know about the financial crisis. It's not coming. The focus here is on Iraq. He has been president now for 6+ years, and yet, as we read about it in the book, it still seems inexplicable. The man that we have just met in the third part of the book, the 40-something midlife crisis, George W. Bush, it's inconceivable that that man is going to become president. He has no political future. He's going to run a baseball team, and that seems to be the limit of his ambitions. And yet, within a few years, Karl Rove, in the novel Hank Ucker, have crafted a campaign for him that makes him, in the novel, governor of Wisconsin. And then he becomes a second-term governor of Wisconsin. And he becomes a cipher for Hank Ucker's ambitions to reimagine a version of Republican politics, of conservative politics, for which he thinks this guy is perfect. Baseball, down home, got a born-again story, got an absolutely perfect wife, but is also a bit of a blank slate, a bit of an empty vessel to be filled up with the right ideas. He's not electrifying, but he's competent on the stump. He seems sincere. He's also wry and a little bit self-deprecating. He makes him governor. He gets him re-elected as governor. And then in 2000, in the novel and in real life, he doesn't get him elected president because the conventional wisdom now is that he lost that election, the closest election, the one that had to go to the Supreme Court, but he gets him into the White House. And then he gets him re-elected in 2004. And in 2006-07, where we are in the novel, there he is, second-term president, bit of a lame duck, deeply unpopular. But for those of us reading the novel who have jumped from midlife crisis Charlie Blackwell to second-term president Charlie Blackwell, it's still astonishing that he should be president at all. And Alice writes about his presidency in terms that show that a little part of her still shares that absolute astonishment. It is completely unexpected. This is not the way her life was meant to go at all. She had no inkling of this. Certainly not when he was drinking and taking coke, but also not even when she married him, where he was running for office. It was clearly going nowhere. And now he's a 2-term president of the United States, and she is one of the most famous women in the world and the second most popular woman in the United States after Oprah Winfrey, married to the most unpopular man or one of the most unpopular men. It is a mystery to her. But she's also aware that no one really understands her husband. Everybody only sees half of him, and they see the half that they want to see. So by the time that he is president, he is still recognizably the man that she married. He is still the frat boy. He is still wry and humorous and crude and optimistic. He is a bit callow, a bit childish. He is still very dependent on her. He is still afraid of the dark. And at the same time, he is a conviction politician. He believes the stuff he's doing. He's really committed to it. He now knows what his legacy is going to be. He's going to have the kind of legacy he never dreamed of, for better or for worse. And he is fully inhabiting the role of President of the United States, and he enjoys it. And many Americans think that he's not up to the task, and they think it's ridiculous that this man, who had a reputation for being stupid but wasn't stupid, but nonetheless, they think it's ridiculous that this farting frat boy should be president of the United States. But he doesn't think it's ridiculous. He thinks he's up to the job, and he is convinced that he knows what he's doing. And he's convinced he knows what he's doing in Iraq. And though the world may have turned against him, and the American public may have turned against him, he's still convinced that he's on the right track. And he is sincere. He is a sincere conviction politician. The people who still like him see the sincere conviction conservative George W. Bush. The people who loathe him just see the inadequate. Alice Blackwell, almost alone, sees both, and she feels both. She is both incredibly impressed that her husband is president and is performing this job in a way that is pretty convincing. And at the same time, she can't believe it. She still can't believe it. At the very, very end of the book, she makes her final confession. Again, we assume this is not true of Laura Bush. In fact, I'm sure it's not true of Laura Bush. But Alice Blackwell confesses that in 2000, she didn't vote for her husband. She voted for his opponent, who she thought would make a better president of the United States. And she has never told anyone that, except for the reader. She sees both sides of it. She also recognizes that part of what's going on here, weirdly, is an accident of physiognomy, because one of Charlie Blackwell, George W. Bush's problems is that his face always looks a bit like he's smirking. In the novel, the most striking instance of this is when Alice tells Charlie she's going to leave him. She simultaneously can see that he is horrified and blindsided and devastated. And she also says, unfortunately, because he's Charlie, it looks like he's smirking. The shape of his nostrils, the shape of his mouth, the blinking eyes. He looks always like he's on the brink of either breaking wind or making a joke. And that was true of George W. Bush's presidency. One of his problems was that his face never quite sat right. That rabbit in the headlights look was partly an accident of his facial features. The celebrated moment where it's whispered in his ear when he's reading a book at a kindergarten that the Twin Towers have been attacked. That look on his face, what is that look? It doesn't quite look right. It's startled, but it's also like in the back of his head, he's thinking, am I meant to find this funny? He is the accidental president, and yet he loves it. And he fully inhabits the role. He is comfortable. He is relaxed. Even when he's unpopular, he really enjoys being president. And she is also divided because she loves it and she hates it. She, in the novel, Alice, hates being First Lady. She never dreamt of being so famous. Earlier in the book, we're told that her father's mantra was, fools' names and fools' places are often seen in public places, i.e. no one should ever get in the newspapers. Anyone who appears in the newspapers is a show-off, a braggart, and a fool. And here she is, as she says, perhaps the most famous woman in the world. She can't understand her popularity, but she relishes it. And she relishes the power. She relishes the perks of the job. She enjoys being First Lady of the United States more than she enjoyed in the novel being First Lady of Wisconsin, which is an arduous job, a time-consuming job. There's a lot of appearing in public places, but there's also a lot of hard work. By the time you get to be First Lady, most of the hard work is taken off you. You have a great staff. People want to make sure you're happy and comfortable. People defer to you. You're surrounded by this bubble of privilege. And she has to admit that it's nicer than being First Lady of a state. It is extraordinarily privileged, and yet, God, she's uncomfortable. And the action of the final part of the book turns on the event, the fictional event that happened to her at the start of the book. Because at the end of the book, the Karl Rove character comes to her and says, someone's about to go public with the news that when you were 17, you had an abortion. First of all, he says to her, is that true? And she says, yes, it's true. And secondly, he says to her, right, we need you to deny it. And she says, I don't think I'm going to be comfortable denying it. And so he says, okay, we're going to have to work out a strategy here. And in the end, she decides to go and see the woman who has leaked the news. There are only really 3 people who could have leaked the news. Her grandmother, but her grandmother is long dead. Her best friend, whom she told at the time, and she suspects it is her best friend because they're now estranged, or the doctor who performed the abortion. It turns out it's the doctor who's now 104, is horrified by her husband's pro-life stance, knows the story of Alice, and wants to pressure Alice to pressure her husband to get his Supreme Court nominee withdrawn. That's the politics here. She goes to see the old lady who's 104. They have a screaming row. She resigns herself to the fact that this news is going to break, and she accepts it. And all the way through this story, when something terrible happens, she accepts it because it is expiation for the sin of her life. The sin of her life is that she killed the boy that she loved when she was 17. Nothing will ever replace that or change that or ever ultimately actually expiate that sin. So she's resigned to it. It never happens. Turns out that row is enough for the 104-year-old doctor to die the next day. But she's told her husband, Charlie/George W. Bush, that the news is probably going to break, that his wife, the First Lady of the United States, had an abortion. And he's accepting of it too, because he has a framework for telling those kinds of stories. The framework being, we're all sinners, everyone has sinned, and we all need to confess our sins. That was her sin. He doesn't understand. She doesn't think that was her sin. She thinks her sin was the thing that preceded it. He thinks that was her sin, but it never happens. Nonetheless, there is a sense in the book that she needs some kind of act of expiation. She needs to do something to reconcile herself to the original sin, which is the car crash. And so she does something else. Rather than discuss her abortion in public, she goes semi-public with her view that the troops should be brought home from Iraq. This didn't happen in real life. Laura Bush remained loyal to George W. Bush, her husband, and his war. But in the novel, Alice doesn't. And he is not forgiving or understanding of that. That's not a sin. That's a political crime. And he is absolutely furious. The novel ends with his fury abated somewhat, partly because she knows that she's going to get away with it, because he depends on her. He is as dependent on her as he has ever been. But he is absolutely furious. He screams at her. Why is she doing this to him? She's doing it to him because it's not about him anymore. She says, I killed someone. And now he's killing tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of people. What does it say about me if I do nothing about it? In the end, because this is Laura Bush's story, the thing that she does at the end of the novel, which is the fictional thing that horrifies the president, the thing that doesn't happen in real life, is because of the thing that happened to her that has nothing to do with him. Her abortion has nothing to do with her husband. In the end, it was a private act that leads to a public act, because this is her story. It is not his story. It's an extraordinary book. It's unputdownable. It's also an amazing book to read now. So I've just reread it. And it's an amazing book to read now because of what's happening now to the First Lady of the United States. At the moment, the world's eyes, as I record this, are on Jill Biden. I don't know what's going to happen in, I think, the week before we put this episode out. The world's eyes, I suspect, will still be on Jill Biden. She is being cast in a completely different role from Laura Bush. Actually, she is one of those rare First Ladies who is now on her way to being even less popular than her husband, because she is being cast in a role that sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, First Ladies get cast in, which is Lady Macbeth. She's the power behind the throne. She's the one who's propping him up. The person that she's being compared to is Edith Wilson, the wife of Woodrow Wilson, who had a stroke at the end of his second term and was basically being kept going by his wife concealing the press and the world, the public, from knowing just what a shocking state her husband was in. But in his shocking state, he nonetheless thought in 1920 that he should run again, because he persuaded himself delusionally that he was the only possible savior of the Democratic Party. And she was with him. until wiser heads in the party told him to pull himself together and told her she was out of her mind. Something like that is going on now. I have no idea at this point who's going to win, but Jill Biden is a crucial figure in current American politics, but she's playing one of those roles that is a kind of cardboard cutout role. You have to fit in one of the possible roles if you are the First Lady, and she's in one. Now, there are other scenarios going on here too. I don't suppose it's going to happen, but it's not inconceivable. It's not outside the bounds of political possibility if something remarkable were to take place in the next few weeks, that Michelle Obama would be the nominee for the Democratic Party, in which case, ironically, the only two women, if it were her, who had a plausible shot at the White House would have as the first ever first gentleman a former president of the United States, Hillary and Bill Clinton, Michelle and Barack Obama. But there are other women who may now turn out to be the first female president of the United States. Maybe it's going to be Kamala Harris, in which case the first gentleman will be Doug Emhoff. Weirdly, if you read this novel now, one of the weird, tiny, but slightly haunting coincidences is that Emhoff is very close to Imhoff, the name of the boy that Alice Lindgren in the fictional version kills. There are so many different ways of being First Lady. There are going to be so many different ways of being First Gentleman. God knows how you do it if you were president. God knows how you do it if you weren't president. God knows how you do it. Part of the point of this book is it gives an exquisite inside account of someone who is poised and in many ways reconciled to herself and to her fate, and is fully aware of the privilege and luxury of her life and half loves it, and still every day thinks, how the hell do I do this? And it's partly because she's aware, Alice Lindgren, Laura Bush, that she is a cipher. It's insane that she's the second most popular woman in the United States after Oprah Winfrey. What has she ever done? She was a librarian and a school teacher, and then she married a farting frat boy who by some accident of fate became president of the United States. And now she's the most popular woman in America. What did she do? She didn't do anything. She was a cipher. She was something or someone onto whom people could project, because that's all you can be as the spouse. That's all you can ever be as the spouse. You're not really allowed to be yourself. There are a couple of moments in this novel, particularly at the end, but it's only fictional because Laura Bush never did it, where Alice Lindgren makes it clear that she is her own person. But these are moments in a story where the moments are incredibly rare, because as First Lady, her job is not to be her own person. The only way she can control the story is by not becoming the story. But if you don't become the story, then you allow people to project onto you. It is catch-22. There is no way to do this job. Jill Biden maybe is now trying to control the story, so she's become the story, so she is in the firing line, but she doesn't actually have the power. It's a nightmarish situation for her, and it may well end very, very badly. Or you're Laura Bush, or a variant of that, where you are the one who deliberately doesn't put yourself in the limelight and thereby occupy the limelight, but you occupy the limelight as a cipher. People project onto the husbands too. People project onto the presidents. Presidents are ciphers in a way. George W. Bush was definitely a cipher for what people loved and increasingly for what they loathed. But at least as president, you are allowed to tell your own story. As First Lady, you're not allowed to tell your own story unless you have a novelist like Curtis Sittenfeld to tell it for you. We've got one more episode coming up in this series. If you'd like to find out more about what we're doing and what we've got coming up, do, as always, follow us on Twitter/X. I still want to call it Twitter, at PPF Ideas. The final episode in this series is not a novel. It's not a play. It's a musical, Hamilton. There's so much to say about it. I'm going to be talking about it next time. Do join us for that and for what's to come. Some of our contributors talking about their favourite political novels and plays. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.